Imagine spending 6 years and your entire fortune searching for something that might not even exist anymore. Now imagine really breaking through a sealed door and finding proof that someone had already been there. They'd broken in first, thousands of years earlier. Was there anything left at all? And who exactly got there before you? Stick around to the end, because after this episode, you'll never think about ancient Egypt the same way again. I promise you. Welcome to Adventures in History. I'm your host Danny, and every week we dig up a fun, surprising true story from the past that your whole family can enjoy. This is episode number 6. If you haven't checked out any of the prior episodes, take a listen. I guarantee you're going to learn something. Let's get into today's story. In November of 1922, a team of archaeologists in Egypt broke through a sealed doorway that they've been searching for 6 years. They were hoping to find one of the last untouched royal tombs left on Earth, but almost immediately they noticed something strange. Signs that someone had already might have been there thousands of years earlier. Had that treasure already been taken? Was this whole thing just about to end in complete disappointment? What if anything was waiting behind that door? To understand how we even got to that nerve-wracking moment, we have to rewind 6 years and meet the stubborn archaeologist who almost gave up on that whole thing completely. Welcome to Adventures in History. Let's get into it. Our story begins in 1918 and we meet an archaeologist named Howard Carter. Now, Howard Carter in 1918 became completely convinced that somewhere in the valley in Egypt, called the Valley of the Kings, there was still one undiscovered royal tomb waiting to just be found. It was the tomb of a young pharaoh named Tutankhamun. Now in this episode, I'm going to keep referring to him as King Tut, because honestly, after doing so much searching of how to actually pronounce this pharaoh's name, I still don't know how to pronounce it properly. So we're just going to refer to him as King Tut. Alright, let's keep going. So for more than 6 years, Carter and his team searched. They dug, they sifted through sand and rubble, season after season, with basically nothing to show for it. And he wasn't doing it alone. I mean, he needed actual money to keep going, to finance the project. So his financial backer, named George Herbert, who was a wealthy English lord, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, who was funding this incredibly expensive search totally out of his own pocket. And year after year, they just kept coming out empty, with nothing to show for it. I mean, that's a lot of money to just keep pouring into something that looked more and more like a dead end, right? And eventually Lord George, he told Carter he could only fund exactly one more exhibition, one more digging season. And if nothing turned up this time, that would be the end of the whole project, for good. One more season, that was it. And everything was riding on it. So in November of 1922, Carter went back out into the Valley of the Kings from what might have been his very last chance. Let's head into part 2 and find out if he found anything. Alright, so almost immediately into that final digging season, Carter's team potentially uncovers something promising. So Carter assembles together a bunch of his very best and strongest archaeology friends, and they go out into the field with shovels and buckets and their best tools, and they're digging and they're searching. And Carter suddenly hears a sound as he's digging. It was as if his shovel had hit something underneath the surface, something metal. So he throws his shovel to the side and he's excited, and he gets on his knees and he's just digging through the sand with his own hands. And his team is anxious. They're looking down at him as if they had just discovered something. And as he's sifting through the rubble with his own hands, he suddenly comes across something potentially incredible. He uncovers a hidden staircase buried beneath the sand, beneath years of debris. So they clear it out and they realize that they've just found a sealed doorway at the bottom, stamped with a royal symbol marking a potential burial site. And Carter just realizes that maybe this was going to be the highlight of his career. I mean, he had just searched 6 years for something that was only really imagining. He didn't know if it actually existed, and here he was standing in front of a sealed door with a marking on it that is showing that potentially somebody very, very old might have been buried in here. And this should have been a moment of pure celebration for Carter, except he's looking at the closed door, and Carter notices something really concerning. See, part of that doorway had clearly been broken into. and potentially resealed at some point. But it was long, long ago, like we're talking ancient times, not recently. And as the team kept digging, they found a long passageway packed with rubble that was meant to block out intruders. But as Carter examines the passageway a little closer, he notices that there's a small part of that passageway that had actually been dug through. See, there was one section that had been almost drilled through and then resealed back up with a different color of stone. And then suddenly his heart sinks to the floor because he realizes that he had just come across the unmistakable signature of tomb raiders, tomb robbers. He had found a tomb that had been raided, that had been broken into, and he was going to need to sit with this nerve-wracking question. See, every other single tomb discovered so far in that valley had already been completely emptied out by robbers centuries and centuries ago. Was this one about to be the same story all over again? Had he just spent 6 years of someone else's entire fortune only to find an empty room? Well, there was only one way to find out. Let's head into part 3. Alright, so Carter is standing instead of the sealed door, and he realizes that he needs to let Lord George know immediately. So he climbs back up out of the archaeological site and he goes to the nearest telegram office. And he sends out a telegram to Lord George. And Lord George rushes over to Egypt almost immediately, it seemed, to be there in person for whatever they found next. And together, they clear out a passageway that reaches a second sealed door. So Carter pauses for a second and he realizes that something amazing might be behind this door. But they can't just blast through. They can't just kick it down. I mean, they don't know what's behind it. So Carter decides to make a small, tiny hole in the corner of the door. And it is pretty dark in there. So he lights up a candle and he holds it up to the small hole at the corner of the door. And he peeks inside. And Lord George is behind him. And he's feeling pretty anxious because this is maybe his financial future on the line. Right? He doesn't know, but he's hoping that they found something amazing, something that could actually give him some recognition because he had paid so much money. He had spent so much of his own fortune on just searching for these things that he and Carter both believed in. So as Carter peeks in with the candle through the darkness, Lord George is behind them and he asks, "Well, can you see anything?" And Carter takes a deep breath and looks back, and he says, "Yes, wonderful things." And Carter's answer becomes one of the most famous lines in the history of archaeology. Yes, wonderful things, he says. Because despite those earlier signs of an ancient break-in, the room in front of them, well, it was still absolutely packed with treasure. Gold statues, gold chariots, jewelry, furniture. It turned out that ancient robbers had likely only managed to squeeze through a narrow gap, and they just grabbed a couple of small, easy-to-carry things with them right before they got resealed out. See, everything else, including the actual boy king's own mummified body, was deeper inside, and it had remained essentially untouched for more than 3,000 years. It was instantly one of the biggest archaeological findings in human history. And once the word got out, absolutely everyone wanted to get a piece of this story, which is exactly where things are about to get pretty complicated. Let's head into part 4. So Lord George needs to find a way to cover this enormous cost of this entire excavation. And he makes a business decision that ends up causing, well, a whole new kind of drama. So he sells the exclusive rights of this enormous discovery, enormous archaeological findings, just to one newspaper, the Times of London. That's right. That meant that every other newspaper and reporter on Earth was completely shut out. No official updates, no direct access, nothing. And reporters who get shut out of the biggest story of the century, they don't just quietly give up. So a lot of the rival newspapers, they just started printing increasingly wild and dramatic stories. And maybe a little bit untrue, just to compete and sell newspapers. And this is actually where the famous mummy's curse legend actually comes from. See, frustrated rival newspapers they popularized a dramatic warning. They basically came up with a story that said that there was this ancient inscription found right at the entrance of the tomb. And this ancient inscription promised doom and gloom for anyone who dared disturb the boy king's rest. And he was a complete myth. In fact, no such cursed inscription was ever actually found anywhere inside that tomb. And it doesn't appear anywhere in Carter's own detailed notes or photograph, and Carter took detailed notes. It was essentially invented, or at the very least heavily exaggerated, by newspapers who just wanted a spookier and a more dramatic headline than just, archaeologists carefully cataloged old furniture. And the legend picked up even more steam when a few months later, Lord George happened to pass away in Cairo from a totally unrelated illness. And it was a pretty weird coincidence. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, a man who had just found a 3,000-year-old tomb somehow passes away weeks or a few months right after he finds that really old archaeological finding. That raised a few eyebrows. But if you're running a newspaper, that is an absolute goldmine, right? That is a coincidence you cannot ignore. And the press absolutely could not resist turning it into front page news. So that quote-unquote curse was mostly just a media invention. But that doesn't mean that everything about the discovery was squeaky clean, because there's actually a real mystery buried in the story that historians still argue about today. Let's head into part 5. So here is a controversy that doesn't get talked about nearly as much as the curse legend. But honestly, it might even be more interesting, at least I think so. See, some historians have raised serious questions over the years about whether Howard Carter actually privately kept, or maybe quietly gifted away, a handful of smaller treasures from the tomb before they were officially logged, cataloged, or recorded. He's the one who first found the tomb. He's the one who first walked in. Think about the position Carter was in. He was standing in a room absolutely overflowing with priceless treasures, one-of-a-kind objects, with very few people watching closely enough to notice if a small coin, a small item or two went missing along the way. And some of those pieces apparently just miraculously showed up over the decades in museums and private collections with very unclear origins. Where did they come from? And Carter obviously denied any serious wrongdoings. And to be fair, running a project of that size where you have to catalog things and write things down by hand, a few things might be missed, fair enough, right? There could be some confusion about records and items that may have been lost. That's expected. But that question has never really gone away. So was Howard Carter secretly a bit of a thief, on top of being a groundbreaking archaeologist? Well, historians don't fully agree on the answer. And it turns out Carter wasn't just fighting off suspicion rumors. He also found himself in a very real, very public fight with actually an entire government. We're going to talk about that in part 6. So at the time of the discovery, Egypt was in the middle of a major political shift. They were pushing for more independence and more control over their own affairs, after basically decades of being under British rule. But here comes this British-led team of archaeologists, and they make an incredible finding inside of Egypt. A lot of Egyptian officials, they were understandably furious. And this wasn't just about artifacts, it became a genuine symbol of a much bigger struggle over who really controlled Egypt's own history. There were tensions between Carter's team and the Egyptian government, and they grew so intense that at one point, Carter was actually locked out of the tomb entirely, in the middle of his own project, during a very heated dispute over access and control in Egypt. Picture that. You just spent 6 years searching and digging. You finally find yourself standing outside a door, and that you're not even allowed to open anymore. It took real negotiation before Carter was actually even allowed to finish the job, before he was allowed back in. So between the media chaos, the theft accusations, and an international political standoff, this discovery turned out to be a whole lot messier than the simple curse story that most people know about. And here's the wildest part. Even after a full century, the story still isn't completely finished. Let's head into our final part. So Decades after the original discovery, modern researchers started wondering whether King Tut's tomb might actually be hiding someone else entirely, or something else. A secret, sealed off chambers tucked away behind the walls that Carter's team may have missed. They may have never even known it was there. And some experts have a specific theory that one of these hidden spaces might even lead to the tomb of a queen called Queen Nefertiti, one of ancient's most famous and mysterious royal queens, who has never actually been found. Now, using modern technology, scientists have actually gone back to examine the tomb's walls, searching for any hint of hidden passageways. And so far, the results have been pretty unclear. Studies haven't really been able to confirm anything as of yet. It's a real unsolved mystery, sitting right in the middle of one of the most famous archaeological sites on the entire planet. Alright, so let's pull this whole story together. We met a really determined archaeologist who nearly ran out of chances before making the discovery of a lifetime. We watched him find a chilling evidence that ancient robbers may have already beaten him to the punch, only to discover that there was actual treasure still very much there. We saw a media war invent a curse legend that never actually existed in the tomb at all. And underneath all of that spooky legend, we found something arguably more interesting, real questions about missing treasures, a genuine international political standoff, a mystery about hidden chambers that historians still can't really find the answer to. So here's a fun thought to leave you with. Carter spent 6 years searching and digging for something that he really believed in. He didn't quit when times got tough, he just kept going, having faith in himself that he'll eventually discover something. So as you look around your own life, what is something that you believe in so much that maybe hasn't been discovered yet, but you absolutely must keep going? Thank you so much for joining me on this adventure into history. Hey, if you're watching on YouTube or Spotify, will you hit that like button or consider subscribing and following? And if you know somebody who will enjoy these stories, will you share it with them? It'll mean the world to me. I'll catch you next time.